Welcome, everybody. My name is Milda Zelensketa. Some of you know me. You should see on the screen my colleague Aida Jairo and our wonderful panelists today, everybody. Paul Baldassari from a global electronics manufacturing corporation called Flex, Elizabeth Frantz from Open Society Foundations, Jeremy Clegg from the University of Leeds, Jennifer Gordon from Fordham University, Ding Ding from leading supply chain sustainability consultancy Elevate, LRQA company, and last but not least, Neill Wilkins from the Institute for Human Rights in Business.
So my name is Aida Jairo. Today's event, titled Migrant Workers and Sustainability in Global Supply Chains, opening a dialogue between research, business, and advocacy, is co-hosted by Migration Business and Society, the Center for International Business at the University of Leeds, and the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development at the World Bank.
And I'm seeing people coming in, and I just want to point out that not only are we happy about having 6 truly prominent speakers today, but it's wonderful to see the variety and range of expertise among our audience. We could see that from the registrations. Given that this is a webinar format, we know that the audience cannot really see each other, but we encourage you to participate in the chat and post your questions to speakers in the chat throughout their talks. We'd also like to point out that we received over 250 registrations, and we're delighted that there are people from academia, the NGO world, international organizations, and businesses all joining us today. And what makes us really happy is that this is very much in line with our goal for this webinar, which is to initiate that much needed conversation between different sectors, between research, business, and advocacy.
So we are very grateful to our speakers. So to maximize our time with them, we will not provide detailed biographies, although all of them are very accomplished and well-known in their fields. Our first speaker today is Paul Baldassari. Paul is President of Manufacturing and Services at Flex. Flex is the third largest electronics manufacturing multinational, with approximately 175,000 employees across 30 countries. So thank you very much for joining us. And Paul, I'm passing the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Aida. I'm happy to be with you today. Actually, I'm happy to talk to you today from our largest factory here in Guadalajara, Mexico. And just to give you a few numbers about Flex, we are an electronics company, so we invest heavily in automation, but that is not reducing the number of people that we need to serve our customers. So every year, we and our competition as well is doing about 10% more product or more placement of components for your cell phones or cell phone base stations or anything else that you need to power the internet or things that you need in your cars on electronics or in any type of medical application. But we actually do that 10% of more product or work with the same number of people. So we drive a lot of efficiency, but despite that, our company and the whole industry and many other industries still have a massive need for skilled but also unskilled labor. And to the topic from today, you hear a lot about changes in the business environment, the economy cooling down because of inflation and so on. But the demand for people and the employment percentages that you see in the different economies of the world have not changed. So there's still a massive need for additional labor in many different industries for companies to grow, and the same for us. Despite this need, there is a big impact, I would say, for especially migrant populations from an inflationary cost perspective, right? So the wages are increasing in the industry, but at the same time, costs are increasing at an unprecedented speed in most economies for the people that have the least income. And so companies are looking into all kinds of ways to bridge that gap and make sure that they provide affordable wages to their employees and as well help them to reduce the cost. So for example, here I'm sitting right now through a big shift change of 5,000 people. We came up with all kinds of ideas how we can support people, from transportation to having a shop in our factory where people can buy food for a discounted rate. but it is a general issue, I would say, that hits especially migrant workers because they have normally the lowest wages, and they are supporting the families in their home countries on top of. So while we can always do more, right, people are really trying to do the best to support the workforce, that they have a affordable living situation and affordable cost situation in the areas where they work. I've talked to a lot of my peers in many smaller and larger companies in the electronic industry and in some of the consortiums here, but also to peers of our supply chain and companies that are not related and working in other industries. And we see a gap widening between large companies that can afford to work on sourcing foreign workers to basically fill the needs that they have for open positions, to smaller companies that don't have the network, and they are struggling to, first of all, get access to skilled and unskilled labor in a tight labor market, as well as they want to do the right thing and make sure that the migrant workers are treated in the right way through all the stages, from sourcing to hiring to employment, and having the right working and living conditions, but they don't have the experience nor the skill set. And what we see come up more and more is that governments of home countries actually try to step in here as well, because many of those countries, first of all, face labor shortages within their home countries, and at the same time got a lot of scrutiny on the way that migrant workers have been hired and treated from agencies through hiring fees and so on, as well as they want to make sure that they have this large pool of people that work abroad and normally provide a large part of the income for the families when they send back money. They want to make sure that that flow of money works well too. So there are several countries, like for example the Philippines, that have set up centers around the world now that allow not only large companies like ourselves to hire foreign workers in an, I would say, in a more ethical way, and then making sure that all the stages through the hiring of people are well taken care of. But that allows also smaller companies to access that pool of, for example, Filipino, but also Indonesian or Nepalese workers in a more controlled way that over time should make the situation for migrant workers better. So the other area that is key for us is the whole supply chain. There's been a lot of talk about supply chain transparency and responsibility. And while in the beginning, we focused in our industry and in other industries on the first stages of supply chain, we go now deeper and deeper. So, you know, we, for example, buy components, but then you need energy to make those components as well, or you need minerals to get it as well. And there is many initiatives to make sure that we have more transparency through all those stages of the supply chain, and train more and more of the supply chain partners, and also audit them to make sure that everybody is following the right directions and standards, as well as the supply, or I would say call it the human supply chain, when people are hired and go through the different stages of hiring. So it's a quite complex process, I would say. When you start to attract people in their home countries, you normally have to get to people in the villages where they currently reside, and you have to do that through local agencies. There is no global agency that has the breadth, for example, to be in every small village in Nepal. And then some larger agencies in those countries that manage the whole administration, they manage the health checks, they manage all the logistics around making sure that people get to the main airports, and then with agencies in the host countries that help on the other side on visas and flights and so on and so on. And every time you have several steps, right, there is more opportunity for things to go wrong. So we spend significant efforts to make sure that through all these steps in the human supply chain. We work with the right partners. We work in an ethical way. We work to make sure that people get treated in the right way. But it's quite a bit of effort and requires quite a bit of a network that you get through all those different stages of agencies and local government agencies and so on, to ensure that you find all the right players and you keep working and auditing with your partners and keep the flow of people coming in, and also support them people once they're working in the factories, that they have the right living conditions. So we have here several stages of dormitories, food providers, small shops, and so on as well. So it's quite a complex and intensive task for companies to take care of that. And you can see it's probably easier for big companies that have the volume and the organization to handle that. And that's where it's very important as well that small companies get access to those networks, that they can hire people and then support people in their working and living conditions throughout their whole employment phase. Last but not least, we had a lot of learnings during COVID-19 that showed us how important it is for companies to treat migrant workers through the ups and downs of the economy in the right way. Now, at the moment, everybody is looking for migrant workers and is trying to do their best. But, you know, at some point, the economy will slow down again. And we've seen during COVID-19 what the differentiator it is if you treat your people in a loyal and stable way, and you continue to employ them also through times where you may not have that much need for hiring new people. But at the end, normally we get out of a crisis faster and faster. And if you don't treat your people right and you lose your key talent, then you have a very hard time to start again. So it's not only a personal, I would say, and the human responsibility to treat migrant workers in the right way, but I can also make a strong business case out of those learnings now as well, and show that for companies to succeed in the long run, it is very important to treat migrant workers in the best possible way, in the ups and in the downs, to make sure that you have sustainable growth as a company. But I don't want to take more time of this conversation. I hope I gave you a little bit of an idea of the actual practical implications that we see right now and we all struggle through as employers. And I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And we're glad that you open up the webinar because you share really personal, direct experience. And I know it's personal for Paul because I know he's even slept in migrant dormitories himself to see how the conditions are. But now I'll ask the audience to put the questions in the chat and we'll save them for the Q&A part. And I am delighted to introduce our next speaker, Elizabeth Frantz from Open Society Foundations, one of the largest grant-making networks founded by George Soros. And Elizabeth is the Deputy Director of Equity and Global Programs and the Division Director for Corporate Accountability and Workers' Rights. So Elizabeth, over to you.
So thank you so much to Ida and Milda for inviting me to speak. It's really an honor to be part of this discussion with so many fantastic panelists, including some old friends, Jennifer and Neill, I'm looking at you. I work with the Open Society Foundations, the world's largest private funder of independent groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights. And in the decade that I've been with OSF, I've had the privilege of working with dozens of migrant and worker-led organizations, with legal advocates, researchers, business leaders trying to do things differently, and policymakers building strategies to ensure rights for all workers in global supply chains. The theme of today's dialogue is all around us. Every time we buy a shirt, we pour milk into our tea or coffee, we buy a box of strawberries, every time we take an Uber, behind each of these experiences is a worker, often a migrant worker. And they're all part of a single story about the growth of precarious and informal work. 1 in every 20 workers is a migrant, nearly 170 million people worldwide. If they were a country unto themselves, they'd have more people than Russia or Mexico. For too many of them, decent work remains elusive. In fact, migrants are more than 3 times more likely than non-migrants to be involved in forced labor. Over the last 2 decades, the foundations of a new normative structure have been laid that move us from the notion of voluntary corporate responsibility to mandatory accountability for human rights across global supply chains. From core ILO standards to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, from sector and issue-specific initiatives to the emergence of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, slow but steady progress has been made. It's now clear that voluntary efforts alone are not enough. Human rights are not an opt-in, opt-out. They have to be binding on states as well as non-state actors. The task before us now is to ensure that the international standards come alive. What keeps me up at night is the fact that action needed to do this still lags far behind the urgency of the problem. As next steps, we need to see effective legal mechanisms that allow for remedy in ways that ensure access to justice and create a deterrent for future abuses. We need real investigations, and we need corporate accountability mechanisms that involve meaningful engagement and dialogue with worker representatives. If there's one thing I've learned over the last 2 decades of work, it's that without real dialogue with worker representatives, without respect for freedom of workers to organize, and corporate accountability initiatives will not drive meaningful, lasting progress in the workplace. There are exciting successes that we can learn from in legally binding agreements like the Lesotho Agreement, which really moved the needle in realizing rights. Forged in 2019 by global fashion brands working with trade unions, women's rights groups, and international labor organizations, the Lesotho Agreement is the first of its kind, tackling systematic gender-based violence and harassment at 4 Lesotho factories, affecting 10,000 workers. This set a precedent for future binding agreements. A more recent example is the Dindigul Agreement, signed by Eastman Exports and H&M with trade unions and labor allies in India. Both these examples were driven by women workers coming together to address gender discrimination and gender-based violence in supply chains. The best solutions to advance meaningful, enduring improvements in supply chains involve workers organizing. And we know that in industries with strong trade union representation, there are lower rates of forced labor. Yet, in far too many countries, migrant workers aren't able to access the protections a trade union might offer. This is something that has to be changed to bring international standards to life. I want to turn now briefly to some of the other specific challenges that migrants face in supply chains. The lack of decent work is pervasive throughout much of the global economy, particularly in the informal economy and in under or unregulated sectors. Global value chains have important gender dimensions, whereby women are often relegated to lower level occupations, more insecure jobs with fewer protections. Migrants are especially vulnerable for reasons stemming from their status as non-citizens in the country of work. Precarious work and precarious legal status go hand in hand. The dominant form of legal migration today is temporary migration, which ties migrants to a particular employer. This form of migration policy is spreading as a channel for legal migration. If your legal status is tied to your job and you're already heavily in debt, having paid excessive recruitment fees, as is the case for so many migrants, you're far less likely to speak out about bad working conditions. This sets the stage for exploitation. The point I want to make here is that while there's a role for business to play in supply chains, there's also a crucial role for governments to re-examine migration policy. Temporary migration schemes have commodified workers in ways that have had very ugly racial and gender undertones. We need radically different approaches to migration policy, approaches that don't enable tiered rights that apply to some workers and not others. We need to ensure that all workers have the same protections on the job and the same ability to exercise those rights. It's also time to reconsider how we prioritize labor standards enforcement. Governments spend many more times on immigration enforcement than they do on enforcing labor laws. For example, the US government has spent 11 times more to enforce immigration laws than to enforce the labor laws meant to protect everyone in work sites across the country. We need a rebalancing of priorities to build inclusive economies. Finally, we need to acknowledge labor migration is not going away. Demographic statistics in most OECD countries suggest there are more people dying than being born. In fact, we're entering a period in which in many countries, there's the smallest cohort ever of working people supporting the largest cohort ever of people who are too young, too old, or too sick to work. We're going to need all hands on deck, and we need a vibrant discussion about the policy solutions to this, how and where labor migration fits in, and how to ensure it happens in the context of strong institutions that ensure work rights are protected. This will become an even more urgent issue in the context of climate change and energy transition. Geopolitical factors, climate, and conflict will be closely intertwined in the future and will affect global supply chains in ways we can't even imagine. As we look to green our economies, we need a sharper focus on the ways to avoid harm to human rights and to advance equity and shared prosperity across supply chains. So to sum up, we need action from business to align values with practice in supply chains to make decent work a reality. We need collective action from workers and for that right to be enshrined in legal and policy tools in ways that include migrants. And we need action from states to rethink policy approaches to labor migration and re-examine those that have set the stage for abuse. So let's start the debate, and I hope that talk will become action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. This was extremely insightful. And now over to Jeremy Clegg, who is my colleague at University of Leeds. So Jeremy is Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and International Business Management, and he's also the former president of the Academy of International Business. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jeremy. I will pass now the floor to you.
Thank you very much indeed for the introduction, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this forum. I should say, from listening to the presenters already, very interesting what Paul said about the expansion of demand at his establishment, and what Elizabeth told us about the rights. I hope you can see that my presentation, in a sense, is an aspect of that, because I'd like to explain where I'm coming from. As Aida said, I'm coming from this as an academic, so therefore the PowerPoint, so I apologize for the PowerPoints, but we've got PowerPoints now, the first one. And I'm a Jean Monnet professor. Yes, what does that mean? It means to say I believe in European economic integration. Technically a regional trade agreement, but it's much more deep than that. It's built on the 4 freedoms. Now, the 4 freedoms, as you know, freedom of movement of goods, services, labor, and capital. But the labor is what concerns us today, and it's central. It really is central. It's central to the stability of the euro area, the euro currency, and it's central to social sustainability as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Regional economic integration is a leading example of international business policy from before we started to call it international business policy. So it's worth studying because we can learn a lot from it. It involves the removal of discrimination in all its aspects. Discrimination, goods, services, yes, labor and capital, but including the labor. So therefore, we must have common policies. And I think what we can see in the European Union is something which, of course, is a special case because they're all equal partners. Legally, within the European Union, they're all equal partners. But the world is not like that. The world is not equal partners, and the world is therefore a very patchy world of globalization, various degrees of congruence between countries. So let's think about the sustainable supply chain concept and the evolution of it. And here I'm going to refer to the excellent new book by my colleague in international business, which is Rob van Tulder and Evelien van Mil. Now, this book is extremely helpful, provides, as you can see from the size of it and the fact I could hardly pick it up, it's extremely valuable from the point of view of being an authoritative text. But it gives us procurement in supply chains, sustainable supply chains has the most procurement that is the most positive environmental, social, and economic impacts possible over the entire life cycle. So that's what I mean by sustainable supply chains. Sustainable social sustainability is about identifying, according to the UN Global Compact, identifying and managing business impacts, both positive and negative, on people. So I'm going to pick social sustainability, but in particular to try and give it a direction. In other words, to think about social upgrading, because I don't think we want to talk about social downgrading. Unfortunately, there are many reasons for believing that in the global supply chain that we actually have social downgrading. So it's worth thinking about what are the causes, what are the determinants, and this is where I want to focus my discussion today. So social upgrading is central to social sustainability, and it lies next to it, alongside the other sustainabilities, the economic sustainability and the environmental sustainability. So it's an equal partner in that. Social upgrading, Tillman Altenberg and his team have identified this in an excellent report as being measurable standards, especially wage levels, employment conditions, and enabling rights. We've already heard about enabling the importance of rights. So I would regard enabling rights as an antecedent of measurable standards. For example, the ILO's core labor standards, freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining, which we've heard, non-discrimination, voice and empowerment. This is easy over something like the European Union, or relatively easy, but much more difficult on a wider canvas. And this is the difficulty. So a major problem that we face in our global value chains is that economic upgrading can be accompanied by a range of outcomes. So if I am to criticize my own subject field of international business, which focuses on multinational enterprises, focuses on foreign direct investment, we always used to talk about the importance, and we still do in some areas, of upgrading as a result of foreign direct investment in places. And the assumption is always that it makes things better, that economic upgrading is promoted by inward foreign direct investment. But unfortunately, the reality is different. Economic upgrading may be associated not only with increases, economic downgrading may be associated with some structural problems, but even upgrading can be accompanied by no increase in local value added capture. So what we mean by that is that even though there's foreign direct investment coming in, even though there's economic upgrading, nevertheless, the amount of value added that remains in the local economy may go down, down as a proportion and down in absolute. So it's perfectly possible that that could happen. It could increase, it could stay the same, but it could increase, but it may go down. And we just don't know why that happens. Therefore, the scope for sustainability, social sustainability, ranges all the way from social downgrading all the way to social upgrading. So what we learn from this is that from an empirical point of view, social sustainability is something, in a sense, that depends on other conditions, other factors. Yes, it depends on what we've heard, the rights of people and aspects along those lines. Relevant to our current focus, there are moderating factors are, for example, the division in the workforce between regular employees and irregular workers. And the irregular workers, it doesn't sound like a good term actually calling them irregular workers, but what we mean by that of typically unskilled workers. And when they're migrants, they also, of course, have challenges very often of not knowing the conditions of the economy to which they've moved. Maybe then language skills in the economy to which they've moved are not at the best. And certainly they also add to the labor supply. Now, the interesting thing is that they may add to the labor supply and they may depress wages. As we heard from Paul, it's perfectly possible that if demand is growing fast enough, even though if demand is growing fast enough, it's possible still that there might be an increase in the wages. But in the general case, we could say that certainly inward migration is going to generate a downward pressure on wages. So we can see there is some sort of a tension here. So definitely this division in the workforce is a problem. Tilman Altenberg and his team also write, the causal relationship between economic and social upgrading is not yet fully understood. And in that, they are absolutely right. And that was as of last year. And now I'd just like to talk about something that was the outcome of some PhD research at Leeds by my former PhD student, Dr. Miguel Dindial. Now, Miguel comes from Trinidad and Tobago, and I believe he's probably in the audience today, so it would be very good to just acknowledge that. And his research in his PhD sheds light on the mechanism, on the type of way in which the causal relationship might exist. And obviously, he's going to be researching this in the future. He's going to actually come back to Leeds at the new academic year to take up a postdoctoral research fellowship. So what he discovered was that dominant firms, multinationals and or their suppliers in the chain are progressively able to change the local economic ecology, the competitive structure of markets in their own favor, using approaches that they've used in other countries and reapplying those approaches. And those approaches, I'm afraid to say, they are a way of reducing the local value capture. Therefore, the reduction of the local value capture leads to economic upgrading in the sense of there's more capital equipment and all of that, but the returns to labor and the returns to the local people go down. So it spirits away the bargaining power of people in the local economy. That's interesting, but we don't know the full mechanism. And as I say, Miguel will be researching that further. But the impact of economic upgrading on the most vulnerable groups in the supply chain certainly demands further attention, as the report by Altenberg emphasizes. So let me move towards a conclusion of some description. We're at the point where theory building is necessary for that causal relationship so that we can develop an understanding of how we might ask of large data sets how there is a relationship between economic upgrading, environmental upgrading, and also social upgrading, social sustainability. My own area of international business policy it's got a big work on its hands because we've often talked only about multinational firms and how to help them become more profitable. That is not what we are about today. And I want to emphasize that now that is the new mission of my subject field. Then there's no more worthy application of how to take this action forward within the academic domain. We're at the point where we know all of the science in the sense of the foreign direct investment theories, the multinational business theories. We now need to apply them to social impact. And that is what that is what my subject field is committed to doing now. And there's no more worthy application of the skills that we have within international business than to look at social sustainability in global supply chains. So I'm very grateful to you for listening to me today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. This was very powerful. And if we could, we would start talking about this and probably talk for hours, especially for the academics out there, because I also already saw questions in the chat related to the teaching and research impact in this area. But we'll again hold on the questions for the Q&A. And I am proud to introduce our next speaker today, Jennifer Gordon. Jennifer is professor of law at Fordham University. And I'll keep that biography very short, but I would like to point out that besides her academic work, she founded and directed nonprofit Immigrant Workers Center in Hempstead, New York, back in the day called the Workplace Project. So she also has a very personal approach to the topic. Jennifer, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So as we know, our topic today is migrant workers and sustainability in supply chains. So I want to talk about a serious threat to that sustainability, which is forced labor. And if you just look around the world, right, empirically, you can see that a great deal of the forced labor in the world is occurring, A, at the bottom of supply chains, and B, involves migrant workers. And so what I want to talk about today is first how we should understand this, and second, how we should respond to it, with a particular focus on how states should respond to it. So I think that it's fair to say that it's already been established that it's not, for example, a coincidence that we see this emergence of forced labor among migrants at the bottom of supply chains. And I would argue that it's also not the result of migrant ignorance or language issues. So the problem isn't in some quality of the migrants themselves. And finally, I would say, I don't think the problem is that we have a few bad apples that are causing the situation. Rather, I would characterize it as a structural result of supply chains and the pressures within them. So let me say what I mean by this. I think when we talk about global supply chains, it's now commonplace to understand that a lead firm or brand is going to seek out, as a country of production, a place where labor costs are lower. But as time goes on and as the pressure for profit increases, lead firms continue to demand lower prices, shorter lead times, that is to say, faster turnaround, and so on. And in countries of production, it's becoming more common that suppliers are pressured to lower wages below what workers in those countries are willing to accept. And as a result, in order to keep producing for those supply chains that they're linked to, they look outside of their countries for a labor force, right? Paul and Elizabeth both alluded to this. And what I want to note is that when that happens, when suppliers in countries of production look outside their country in order to get workers who will work for less, it brings a whole other supply chain into place. And Paul used the phrase human supply chain. And I just want to note that there's a parallel process in the human supply chain, right? We're used to, let's just call this the lead firm at the top in a product supply chain, and here are the suppliers. So if the suppliers are leaving their country to look for workers, it brings another supply chain into being, the human supply chain. And as we go down that supply chain, as Paul noted, it introduces a whole other series of intermediaries and opportunities for extraction of money from migrants. And the result is that migrants, as they travel up the supply chain to meet the jobs at the bottom of the global supply chain, often come deeply indebted, and as Elizabeth noted, on visas that structure them as unable to leave an abusive job, because if they do so, their ability to remain in that country will end, because almost universally, the visa is tied to a single employer, right? So, of course, hiring migrants in these situations does achieve the goal of lowering labor costs, but it also drastically increases the risk of forced labor. So the question is, what do we do about this, right? What do we do about forced labor at the intersection of the product supply chain and the human supply chain? Another way to frame this is, how do we address forced labor in supply chain governance? I would say, how do we address forced labor when it occurs at the intersection of trade and migration, right? That's just, all those things are ways to frame exactly the same question. And I want to focus on state level responses here. There are other responses as well, but I'm particularly interested in talking about the divergence between the model that states in the global north are pursuing, comparing the EU model and the US model, which are really very different. And And the two questions I'm interested in here, only one of which I think we have the information to answer, is first of all, looking at these different models, do they actually change the incentives and behavior of the actors at the top of the product supply chain, the lead firms, who I'm arguing are driving structurally this incidence of forced labor among migrants? The second question, the one I don't think we're yet positioned to answer, but I'm working on it, is to what extent these two models advance the needs of migrants at the bottom of these supply chains as the migrants themselves define them. This relates back to what Elizabeth said about the key importance of migrant organizing and power and migrant self-determination, workers being able to decide what works for them. So I'm going to put that question aside for the rest of my talk, having noted how important I think it is that we better understand that. If we look at state models for addressing forced labor in supply chains, as I noted, we see a real divergence between the European Union model at the moment and the US model. The European Union, as I'm sure most of you know, has created mandatory human rights due diligence regimes, which focus on the lead firm's obligation to monitor conditions in their suppliers and also to be transparent about the findings of that monitoring, right? So that's a risk assessment that firms are required to carry out. The US, on the other hand, has very little mandatory due diligence, and instead, as to forced labor, has gone all in on the trade model. The US has something called the forced labor import ban, which allows the US government to stop goods that they suspect are made with forced labor at the border. So I would guess that most of you are more familiar with the due diligence model, or at least that my brief description has done enough to give you a sense of what it is, but maybe less familiar with the US model. So let me say another word or two about that before I compare them. In the US, we have long had the ability to stop goods at the border if they're made with forced labor, in theory, but it took a reform in US law that went into effect in 2016 before that became a much more practically usable tool. Since then, the US government has dramatically increased its use of this tool to stop goods at the border. In the years since then, it has imposed orders stopping goods at the border 43 times against goods from 12 countries in a range of industries. And then in 2021, the US Congress extended this ban to all products made in Xinjiang, China. So we have quite a wide scope of goods either already under bans or potentially under bans. So each of these two models, I think, operates from a different diagnosis of the problem and has different strengths and weaknesses. The human rights due diligence model, the implicit diagnosis of the problem is that it's a failure of supply chain monitoring, right? That the problem of forced labor arises because lead firms are insufficiently attending to the conditions at the bottom of their supply chains. A great strength of this model, in my view, is that it recognizes the role of the lead firm in structurally driving the occurrence of forced labor at the bottom, and also that it locates the problem within the EU, right? It understands the problem of forced labor in supply chains as something states must address in the countries where the lead firms are located. Identifying the weaknesses of that model, in my view, is that even though it's mandatory, human rights due diligence focuses on the process of monitoring and risk assessment as opposed to the outcome. That is to say, you are punished as a firm for failing to monitor or to do the diligence, but not for the actual outcome, forced labor or not, in your supply chain. And also, I would say a weakness is how heavily invested the due diligence regime is in the social audit as its mechanism. Social audits in many contexts have been revealed to be deeply flawed as a mechanism for really understanding the conditions at the bottom of supply chains. Turning to the forced labor import ban, very different diagnosis. The diagnosis there, again, implicit, is that forced labor is a problem of unfair competition in trade, that it undercuts products, forced labor undercuts products made with respect for labor conditions, and therefore that it should be addressed through trade sanctions. I see its strengths, that model, the forced labor import ban strengths, in that it locates, its strengths are that it focuses on the outcome. A risk assessment or transparency will not allow you to avoid the sanction of being stopped, having the goods stopped at the border, right? So it focuses on outcome rather than process. If forced labor is present, the sanction can be imposed whether or not the firm at the top of the supply chain has done its due diligence. Its weaknesses are the flip of the due diligence regimes. That is to say, it locates the problem outside the US and at the bottom of supply chains. The targets of the punishment are suppliers who are found manufacturing goods under conditions of forced labor rather than the lead firms. Although, of course, there are impacts on a lead firm trying to import goods that are stopped at the border. The sanction is imposed against the supplier company, and a forced labor import ban frames the problem as external to the United States. It has to be governed somewhere else. It's not the fault of US companies. I just want to close by noting that the model of a forced labor import ban is, of course, very much on the European Union's agenda at the moment. The European Commission made a proposal in September of last year. And so it may be coming to the EU. I see the opportunity for a lot of cross-learning between the US and the EU. And just want to close by noting two points of possible concern in the proposal made by the European Commission. Both, I think, are related to the human rights due diligence model being imported into the proposed ban. One is the proposed ban in the EU, like human rights due diligence, relies heavily on social audits and would offer essentially a safe harbor for goods where human rights due diligence had been carried out, even if there was forced labor. And second, again, it shifts the focus outside the EU to the actions of suppliers. But it may be that in combination with human rights due diligence, that there's a sort of more effective pincher effect. So I want to end there just by reiterating what I think are the two key questions to keep in mind about any regime to address issues like forced labor and other serious human rights violations at the bottom of supply chains. Do they actually change the contracting, pricing, and other demand behavior of lead firms at the top of supply chains? And how do they relate to workers at the bottom? Do they open a space for workers or provide a tool to the workers themselves to advance their own interests as they define them and help them build power to raise their wages and demand better treatment? Thank you.
This was extremely insightful, Jennifer. Thank you very much. So we have two more speakers. Next is Ding Ding. Ding Ding is Director of Product and Analytics at Elevate, LRQA, business consulting company focused on supply chain assessment and sustainability solutions with clients in more than 100 countries. Thank you very much for joining us today, Ding Ding. So please, I'm passing the floor to you.
Thank you, Ada. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Ding Ding from Elevate. we're actually, I think this is such an interesting panel. Thank you so much for organizing it, having me here, because I feel like we represent different viewpoints. So as you may have heard, Elevate is a consulting firm, global consulting firm that specialized in ESG and supply chain management. So we're an audit firm that do the audits in factories globally. And we're also the training partners to support clients, brands, retailers to, build the capacity of their factories to help them understand what is the expectations and how they can remediate those issues. We do about 20,000 audits a year globally in over 100 countries across different sectors, from apparel, electronics, hard goods, all the way to automotive or toys and others. I'm based in Hong Kong from China originally, very happy to be here. And I want to share a few stories about what we know and what we have learned about foreign migrant workers in the supply chain. The first story I want to share is about Malaysia. I think Paul, Jennifer, and other speakers have done a great job elaborating why it is so such a high risk for foreign migrant workers for forced labor. Jennifer mentioned earlier that U.S. has adopted kind of a trade model to discipline companies in the risk related to forced labor. Malaysia is a good example for that. Since 2020, there has been a number of WROs, so withhold release orders, being imposed against a number of Malaysian companies in the healthcare, rubber glove, and palm oil industries. And let's not forget, this is in the middle of COVID. So rubber glove is a critical product for the healthcare sector. But US government CBP imposed those WROs specifically for the risk of forced labor. Want to give you a few numbers that we know from our on the ground work. Malaysia uses workers from neighboring countries such as Nepal, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Thailand, India, and more. The recruitment of human supply chain is complex because there are so many different layers of agents involved. Very often, or in all cases, somebody needs to pay for a fee. It's called recruitment fees. Recruitment fees includes, number one, the service fee paid to the agent for introducing the job or introducing the workers to the employer, or healthcare, health examination fees, or paperwork fees, and also travel costs from the home country to the destination country, which includes both flights and on-the-ground transportation. A typical Bangladeshi workers may pay up to $4,000 per person for their job in Malaysia. And I think you may know Bangladesh is not a very developed country. Their actually average monthly income is about $140 if you work in a Bangladesh factories. So workers typically don't have that much money at hand. Otherwise, they will not travel overseas to leave their families and friends behind, which means that they need to borrow money. So they will be in a debt situation. Do we know how much money they will make in a Malaysia factory? Will be a little bit more, but it's not that much more. It's about 500 or 550 $, including overtime. So it's not just regular hours. It's not a minimum wage. It's their take-home monthly income. So if you compare those numbers, $500 per month, you need to spend money for foods, etc. $4,000 $, you need to pay upfront to get the job. They need to save for a long time to pay back that debt. And we didn't even include the interest rate at all. So that's why, this is recruitment fees or excessive recruitment fees is such an important indicator of forced labor, among other 10 other indicators, according to ILO. Another one will be retention of passports, because factories also pay fees to get those workers. They don't want those workers to leave. Right? What if they abscond? So how do you control that? You keep their passport so that they will not leave the factory. So that's another indicator. What if they are not productive because there are language barriers? You yell at them, or you restrict their access to basic liberties. You limit how long they can take the toilet break, or how many times they can go to the toilet. Those are all indicators of forced labor. And we see that in nearly all countries that use foreign migrant workers. And this is not just Malaysia, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UK, European countries, US, Canada. I can continue. Those are all destination countries for foreign migrant workers. And in every single one of those countries, the risk of forced labor is there. It's not just for developing countries in Asia. For instance, just to give you another number, if you think, $4,000 US is high. In a Taiwanese factory, Taiwan is still quite a key sourcing country for electronics products and, high-end sports gear products. Vietnamese workers pay up to $6,000 US for their job per person, not aggregate, per person, to get a job in Taiwan. And again, excessive recruitment fees will put them in that situation that they cannot leave their job easily. So that's the first story I want to share. Second, have we seen any impact? Have we seen any changes? This is no longer a new topic. Forced labor has been there for a long time. We have seen impact. In Malaysia, for instance, because of the WRO, because of the activists like Andy Hall, there has been a lot of impact. Millions, billions of dollars have been paid back. Take Top Glove as an example. It's a famous large rubber glove factory. They paid $6 million back to workers. So we have seen a lot of impact. And if we add those numbers up, it's a lot of money paid back to workers and has a great impact there. So not all the work that we do has no impact. Audit is not perfect. There are a lot of limitations. So that brings me to the second point. What can we do? So maybe from my point of view, what we typically work with customers. Number one is audits is not a new product. We have been auditing factories since mid-1990s. So it has been a long time. There are a lot of limitations. For one, auditors will not be there all the time. So what if auditor leaves and factory just fall back to the bad conditions and behaviors, right? So brands and clients are revisiting their program to see whether or not they have the right program fit for purpose to identify those risks in the current context. So number one, it means where do they audit? How do they conduct the audits? What kind of standards they need to use to conduct the audits? There are many standards out there, skin audits, every client's COC, etc. Whether or not they're detailed enough or they're servicing the right risks, they're collecting the right data points, those are the questions we're asking customers every single day. That's number one. Number two, whether or not there are other ways that we can use to supplement audits. Given the limitations that we see with audits. For instance, there are many data points out there that we can utilize. Publicly, social media, workers will be there. They will use their Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit and other platforms that they have to report issues. And in countries like China, you will see hotlines or publicly available hotlines on the website where workers or anyone can go on to make complaints about withholding of wages, about excessive working hours, about not paying social insurance in time, etc. So there are a lot of new source of data out there that we need to utilize to supplement audits so that we can better monitor factories' performance on an ongoing basis. That's one. Second, we also need to look at whether or not we're focusing on the right countries. So it's not just about developing countries. It's also about other countries that use foreign migrant workers, such as European countries and the US. So whether or not we're looking at the right countries and what kind of service sectors that we need to be looking at. And of course, audit firms need to do a lot better. We need to strengthen our internal protocol and auditor training to make sure that auditors are aware of those issues and they're prepared to investigate, triangulate information to better service those risks for our customers. So those are the three things that we currently work with our customers to better identify and manage risks related to foreign migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ding Ding, for sharing your experiences. Last but not least, we're delighted to welcome Neill Wilkins. He's the head of Migrant Workers Program at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, which is a think and do tank on the relationship between business, governments, and representatives of civil society. So, Neill, the floor is finally yours.
Thank you very much. I hope that you'll be able to see my slides. Can people see those okay?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So the Institute for Human Rights and Business, just if anyone's not aware who we are a think tank, but we have a strong advocacy strand to the work that we do. So we're at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. We don't just talk about it, we try to advocate for companies and governments to use a human rights lens to view their activities. The IHRB Migrant Worker Programme is perhaps the most established programme and the one for which we're most well known. And I hope that many of people on the call will be familiar with the Dakar Principles here on the right-hand side. The Dakar Principles were 10 years old last year. It seems amazing. I can remember them starting life on my kitchen table, and in association with lots of other organizations, we developed those, and they provide this overarching framework for understanding all of the challenges that migrant workers face at all stages of the employment cycle. And you can see, if you look at the Dakar Principles, they take a migrant worker around a typical migration cycle through recruitment, onto employment, and then on to safe return. We've already really focused in on the key area of concern for many migrant workers, and that is the charging of recruitment fees. And this is the area that we and many others have focused particular attention on, and the clear links between the indebtedness that many workers find themselves in through the payment of recruitment fees, and that links to debt bondage and forced labour and exploitation are made clear. Workers become vulnerable, and then further things will begin to happen to you. So it's not just that recruitment fees are wrong in themselves, it's this loading of vulnerability, additional vulnerabilities onto migrant workers that is perhaps key. So we and lots of other organisations have undertaken a lot of work around the issue of recruitment fees, and the particular initiative that IHRB manage to do this is the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. We currently have 17 large international brands who are members of the leadership group, and they're supported by the UN organisations ILO, IOM, but also Verite, Interfaith Centre and Migrant Forum in Asia, to add some civil society integrity to what it is that we do. And the purpose of the leadership group is to advocate for a global prohibition on recruitment fees. And we do this by promotion of the employer pays principle, that no worker should pay for a job. The cost of recruitment should be borne not by the worker, but by the employer. Now, importantly, there's two parts to the employer pays principle. The first is that no worker should pay for a job. Recruitment fees are wrong. It's wrong that people pay for a job, and we would like to see a prohibition on recruitment fees. But if you just say no recruitment fees to workers, it rather leaves it hanging about who should actually pay. And many companies would just turn around and say, yes, I agree with that, no recruitment fees to workers. But if you say that it's the employer's responsibility, then it sort of moves the conversation along a little bit. Recruitment is a business cost and always needs to be paid by business. So the two parts of the employer pays principle are very important. Now, all of the companies in the leadership group have signed up to the employer pays principle. I don't think that there is one there who would claim that they have cracked this and that workers in their supply chains aren't paying recruitment fees. Somewhere you will find that. Absolutely you will. Some companies are much further along the journey than others, but all of them have that expressed publicly available commitment. But they're not alone. Increasingly, we see a large number of companies now are starting to have a recruitment policy that prohibits charging recruitment fees to workers. And you can find these if you have a look at a new tool from IHRB, the Responsible Recruitment Register. We've trawled company supplier guidance and codes of conduct to find what they're saying about recruitment fees, and where previously a ban on recruitment fees to workers was exceptional. I think if I look here, we can see that currently we found 138 companies that have such a ban on recruitment fees to workers. And we've also recently just launched a second register, which is the associations, and that includes various trade bodies, associations, and certification standards to see if they also include a ban on recruitment fees in their certifications or in their code of conduct for their members. So, for instance, if you're a member of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, you would be expected to adhere to their certification, which does have a ban on recruitment fees to workers, for instance. The reason that we've launched these registers is because there was no way of charting whether we were making any progress or not. We thought that we definitely were making progress, and more companies were starting to put a ban on recruitment fees to workers in place and including that in their agreements with suppliers, but nobody really knew. And so we wanted to increase transparency around that. Transparency is very important in the world of business and human rights, but also calling companies to account for what they are saying that they're doing. We're just trying to make things much more obvious and much more available. We also hope, of course, that it will encourage peer and competitor companies to realize that, look, there's all these other companies now have got this prohibition. Perhaps we need to adopt the same. And also, because we actually print a link to the guidance and the wording of various standards that different companies put out there, you're able to very easily assess the way that you're writing things down for your suppliers, or how you're wording things in contracts compared with peers and competitors as well. So it's trying to move things along. What we don't do and what we're not able to do is assess how effectively any of the companies that are featured in the register are actually implementing the employer pays principle or its equivalent. But we leave that to that would be a very big job, and we leave that to civil society. We also hope that this will encourage recruitment agencies to realise that there is a new market emerging now for companies prepared to pay recruitment costs, and we hope that it would drive a change in behaviour, a new entrance into the responsible recruitment agency market. So you can, if you put responsible recruitment register into a search engine, you'll very easily find this. But I just want to finish really about, and the thing I've talked about, it's very easy to have a policy, but it's far harder to implement these things in practice. And we all know that this is the case. And I've picked out 3 things. I could have absolutely filled a slide with the many reasons that it's difficult to move from policy to practice, but I've picked out 3 things that I think are really important. And the first is lack of oversight and leverage over suppliers. I think it's always very important that we understand the nature of global supply chains. It's very easy to see it as if it were a string of pearls with first tier, second tier, third tier, and so on and so forth, with company having total oversight of what's going on. But the reality is actually it's not like a string of pearls at all. It's like a plate of spaghetti. The minute you get beyond first tier, it's very, very difficult for companies to understand and know where some of the goods and things like that that their suppliers are using are coming from, and the way that they're being produced. And also very often suppliers are very, very reluctant to share that information with the brands because they fear that they'll be cut out of the loop if they are. Also very, very often a company will only be responsible for maybe less than 5% of the output at any given factory, which therefore inevitably reduces your leverage to tell them to do some of the things that you might want to do. Now, we shouldn't give them a free ride on that, because the UN guiding principles do say that if you are in a position where you don't have leverage, you should look for ways that you might increase your leverage. Now, that might be, and this is something that we try to do within the leadership group for responsible recruitment, work collectively with others, work through trade associations, make sure that suppliers are hearing consistent messaging from all companies in a space. But the work with suppliers, I think, is very very important. Second problem is that the flawed recruitment model is very embedded and deeply entrenched. These recruitment practices are very well established now. There's a lot of people who have made a lot of money out of them, and they are so common and so embedded as to become normalized. And so when people suggest that you might wish to do things another way, it seems strange, it seems abhorrent to many people. Why on earth would you not pay? What will happen to me? And we know that recruitment agents frequently take advantage of that, telling migrant workers, if you don't pay recruitment fees, that's a sign that you're going to be trafficked. It's obvious. If you come from a culture where you have to pay for absolutely everything, why would you think that it's okay to be sent halfway around the world for nothing? You can understand the suspicion with which many migrant workers will view free ticket, free visa, as it's known in Nepal, for instance. So we need to recognize the embedded and entrenched nature of recruitment practices, and the fact that very often it's government members of governments who perhaps are also owning recruitment agencies, and the many other people who have a vested interest in maintenance of the flawed recruitment system. And then finally, lack of effective government legislation, and importantly enforcement, because often there's laws in place but no adequate means of enforcing them. We're seeing that a little bit in my own country, in England, at the moment, with some of the licensing from the GLAA falling away. But lack of government legislation and enforcement in some countries is a serious impediment to progress. The UN guiding principles again tell us that there's a responsibility on business to respect, but there's also a responsibility on government to protect. And in many cases, the government responsibility is not being managed effectively. And sometimes that's lack of ability, lack of resources. Very, very often we've got some very poor countries that migrant workers are being sent from, but very often it's down to lack of political will or vested interests that prevent changes in government legislation and enforcement. And we should never forget that, you know, effective government legislation doesn't just protect workers, it protects law-abiding businesses as well. And this was alluded to by a couple of previous speakers. And just finally on this, I think that that's actually where we've been talking about the role of the WROs as well, that and the EU human rights due diligence, that I think that there's also a message that those legislations send out, that they're not just trying to impact on businesses, but perhaps they're also trying to impact on the governments in countries who are supplying goods to Western markets. We've seen things previously like the EU yellow card on fishing products from Thailand. I think that we've seen the US producing the annual trafficking in persons report, and I think that the WROs are intended to, as well as to impact on individual companies, they're also intended to send a message to other companies in that sector, but also perhaps to the government of those countries, that if you want to be importing and sending goods to Western markets, then you need to be making sure that the playing field is fit and proper. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Neill. This was very interesting. Now we will invite all speakers to answer the questions of the audience. And there are many questions, so it will be difficult to ask you all the questions, but I will start maybe with the first one from Cordula Panzanti, and this question is for Paul. We have talked a lot about the lead firm, and for those of you who know, Paul also used to be the Chief Human Resource Officer of Flex. So Paul, how can the headquarter or the lead firm truly ensure that ethical and human work standards are reality on all the manufacturing sites around the world? So
that's a great question, and Neill already showed us a lot of the complexity in I would say all the different stages for hiring. If you're the lead firm, like the brand, right, or if you're the headquarter of a large part of the supply chain, like we are, most important is to understand the different complexities of the different situations that migrant workers are in. It's a very different situation, for example, of a migrant worker in Poland coming from Ukraine. It's a different situation for a Filipino migrant worker who gets hired into Hungary versus a Nepalese worker getting hired into Malaysia. So it's important to understand that human supply chain, understand all the different actors. To what Neill said before, right? My company, but many other companies I know as well, have signed up to pay all the recruitment fees, for example, but that does not prevent the bad actor in this human supply chain, like one of the agencies, to still ask for money from the migrants, right? So you need to make sure that you constantly monitor what's happening in the whole flow of people coming in, and most important, to listen to the people, listen what's most important for them, and that extends beyond the hiring of people as well into the working and living conditions. That starts from making sure that people have access, that they have a voice to the employer, that you translate information, work instructions, but also ethic hotline access and so on into languages that they speak, that they can communicate and express themselves, as well as taking care of the living conditions. As an employer, if I bring someone to another country, I do have a responsibility as well about securing that they have the right bargaining power about the living condition, either if I provide dormitories or if I provide housing support and they find their own housing, to make sure that they have living conditions that are up to a certain standard, and make sure as well that the people have bargaining power on how they're gonna buy their food, how they're gonna buy all the essentials, and how they're gonna transfer money if they wish so to their families back home. Because remittance fees have been enormously high, right, up to 10%. The local economy has also in some cases exploited migrant workers by overcharging them on food prices, on medicine, healthcare services, and so on. So my advice, and the way that I've seen it successfully being implemented in my and other companies as well, is to continuously monitor and listen to people, and most important, make sure to give them a voice and the power to bargain for their essentials, and continuously improve the situation.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I know you could go more into detail on this, but we'll move on with the questions because we don't have much time. Elizabeth, an audience member named Rasa picked up you mentioning the gender issue, and I know that merits a whole, another webinar at least. But maybe you could elaborate in more detail, as briefly as you can or succinctly as you can, on the issues that women migrants in particular face.
Sure. It's a really important issue. So thank you for the question. I would say, women migrants make up almost half of all international migrants. Data from the ILO suggests that they tend to be disproportionately represented in lower paying jobs than men, in more elementary professions, in cleaning work, in care work, in domestic work. There is a pay gap that migrant women face compared to men migrants. Their average earnings are roughly 20% lower than men migrants, according to, again, ILO data looking at 60 different countries. They face discrimination and harassment on the job. As I mentioned, many of them work in care jobs and domestic work. Those sectors tend to be explicitly excluded from labor and social protections. That means they're not entitled to the same rights as other workers, rights to a day off, rights to minimum wage. The isolated nature of work in those sectors also makes organizing difficult, and it can make them more vulnerable to abuse. Again, many women are disproportionately employed in the informal economy, which means they're not able to access social protections in the same way. So this is a hugely important issue. I will stop there so we have time for more questions, but could say lots more about this and what we need to do to address it.
Thank you very much. There are many questions, not so much time, so I will try to, the following question is directed to Neill and Ding, although I know that Paul could also address it. So Samantha Gottel, she asked, what would you say are the key knowledge and skills that a business management student should have to best address and maybe prevent harms to migrant workers and refugees?
Thank you, Ada. I want to confirm my understanding. Are we saying factories, suppliers, or brands, retailers?
I think it's specified in the question, so it could be any area, but summarizing just major skills when somebody is has a business degree and then is starting a job in the private sector and is working in the, let's say, HR department or sustainability or corporate social responsibility department. What skills should he or she have when starting such a position and is also dealing with migrant workers?
Got it. Thank you, Ada, for the clarification. I think there can be many. To be honest, ESG has been such a hot topic recently in the last couple of years. When I joined the sector, it was even not called ESG. Now ESG seems to appear on newspapers almost every day. So hot and center in everything. I would say number one is we need to have actual experiences in a facility, in a supply chain, to understand how it works and the challenges facility managers are facing. It is not easy to manage a large facilities. I'm sure Paul can relate to that with so many people and to deliver everything within short timeline, right? One thing that we need to recognize, the global economy situation has been getting even more challenging, and the requirements and expectations from customers has been expanding all the time. In the past, they may only focus on key labor issues, such as working hours, health and safety. Now the scope has been expanded much beyond that, right? For instance, traceability, supply chain mapping, supply chain visibility, etc. So the bar has been higher and moving all the time, but the money or the price paid to the products has not necessarily increased that much. Actually may have gone down, and the lead time needed for facilities to produce all those products has been shorter, right? So they need to deliver everything, managing workers, and comply with all the requirements at the same time. So the bar is higher. So one key knowledge I will recommend is to understand the facility, how it works, the challenge they're facing, and then work with them to figure out a solution that may work. That's number one. Number two is, like Paul says, these issues are very complex. If we're looking at forced labor in Malaysia, it can be very different than forced labor in India. There between domestic migrant workers and foreign migrant workers, the solutions to those issues is also very different. So it will be very helpful to understand or be able to analyze those different situations and then provide, corresponding solutions. So that's the second one. And the third one, I would say, data analysis skills. That's one skill set that is has been lacking in the industry for quite some time. Right now, there are a lot of discussions about how can we use technology and data to supplement what we have been doing in the past to make, our responsible sourcing programs more effective. So that's also a good skill set to have, to be able to look through all these different audit reports, all these different data points to identify hidden risks. And work with different business to protect foreign migrant workers.
Thank you very much.
The bit I would add in, I think, is that we're starting to move away from ideas where companies have a dedicated sustainability department or an ESG department or a human rights department. We're perhaps starting to see a move where those functions are much more embedded in other functions within the company, or at least there's a greater understanding and appreciation of those functions within other departments in a company. So whereas previously we had that bolt-on sustainability thing, so the company did what it did and then they tried to give it an ESG, a human rights wash or a green wash at the end. We're starting to see that much more closely understood and realized within companies. I wouldn't go all out on that, but we are starting to get there. I think that maybe some of the modern slavery acts have helped a little bit with this, where then that needs to be signed off by executive and therefore it gets taken up through the company. We still see problems, however, where the desire by some people within a company to be much more transparent and get information out there is stymied by the legal department. And a company that would then, absolutely, why would we put anything into the public domain that we perhaps don't need to? But it's a very interesting time to be engaging with business and human rights within companies, and it doesn't need to be as part of a business and human rights department. I think that's the big change that we are starting to see and must hope to see much more of going forward.
Thank you, Neill. That's really the core message, driven to the point. We have 3 questions that fit Jennifer's area of expertise, but I'm worried that we're running out of time. So I'll just summarize that, one of them focused on the forced labor import ban in the US and whether it's effective, the other one on US FAR 2015 regulation. And there's one question that maybe would be relevant for both Jennifer and Neill on temporary labor migration. But I'm afraid I'll have to keep those aside because they would also require a lot of time and detail. I would instead like to ask Jennifer and Jeremy as professors the question that Joe posted in the chat for PhD students, because we could see a lot of the people in the audience were PhD students. With all the academic pressures that they face to publish, how can they engage in issues that you addressed and more socially or impact-oriented issues in their very early careers of academia? If you could just provide a final words on that, and then unfortunately we'll have to say goodbye.
Would you like me to do that?
Yeah, go ahead, maybe start, Jeremy.
All right, I'll start. All right, okay. I should say that the Academy of International Business, which you mentioned at the beginning, has a journal which is called the Journal of International Business Policy. The Journal of International Business Policy in December 2019 had a special issue on migrants, migration policies, and international business research, current trends and new directions. I would say the Journal of International Business Policy will be a very good home for you. It's not yet it's not CABS rated, but watch this space, folks. I should tell you that. But I think it's going to be a career-building journal for researchers coming into the field. We also have the Journal of International Business Studies, which I think is well known as being a top-rated journal. Now, the Journal of International Business Studies has a new editor-in-chief, Rosalie Tung, and Rosalie has, in her inaugural editorial, stated that she's interested in societal impact. So, folks, what I'm saying to you now is using the science that we have within the field of international business research, now apply it to those societal impact topics and you will be picked up, you will be recognized for your contribution. So now is the right time.
Maybe I would just say one sentence. In addition to looking from the top down and trying to understand what's going on from a top down perspective, as academics, it's critically important to consult with and study and represent the viewpoints of workers and their organizations. So a plug for that as we close.
So I think I would like now once again to thank all the speakers and also the audience for very, very thought-provoking conversations. Also special thanks to Joe and Jasper for all the backstage work in helping us to organize this webinar. And also special thanks to our partners at Nomad for the organizational promotional support. Thank you all very much.
And again, we know that the conversation could have kept going. We also know that many of you looking at the participants' profiles work on issues that we discussed today, but we also know that from the questions that there's some of you who perhaps do not yet. And so we hope that this conversation will inspire you to do so, whether as academics in research and teaching, or as human rights advocates, or as business people who seek to make positive impact in their companies. If you'd like to stay connected and be invited to our next webinar or access useful resources, please visit our website, Migration, Business and Society. I just put the link in the chat, and the recording of today's webinar will also be available there along with other useful videos. So thank you once again for joining us today. We will stop the recording here as well. Thank you.